Recording in progress.
Welcome, everybody, back to The Broken Brain. It's me, your host, Dwight. Glad to be with everybody yet again on our journey into the world of culture, psychology, and all kinds of interesting fascinations, which today's a really, really fascinating, not fascinations. That's how you say that, everybody. Fascinating trip into humanity and just the way that we all develop. I just can't say enough about it without getting way too excited. I've been reading this really cool book by our guest, and I'm excited to get into it today to tell you all about it, and more importantly, to let him tell you all about it. I'm joined today by Nathan Lents, who's a professor of biology at John Jay College, City University of New York, and the author of the new book, The Sexual Evolution: How 500 Million Years of Sex, Gender, and Mating Shape Modern Relationships. Dr. Lentz, thank you for being here.
It's my pleasure, and thanks for the invitation.
I very nearly in my notes, I had not written down the word million, so I almost said how 500 years of sex, gender, and mating shaped modern relationships, and I thought that'd be a much shorter book, probably. Right.
It would be, but it'd be a much sadder one because the influence of the last 500 years hasn't been great.
Yeah. As you highlight in the book, that not all of the evolution of those things have been good, or in not only has the social evolution not all been good, it's not been in keeping with the biological evolution, has it?
Yeah, that's exactly what I would say is actually the shaping that culture has given us for the last 500 years has really narrowed our expression of sex and gender and sexuality to just one little slice of it. So, yeah, I would say that that's almost the exact opposite book that I would write. And, it's funny that you say that because I was on a podcast last week with someone that I wrote to them because the author took the exact opposite position as me about, monogamy and marriage and sexuality and everything else, about saying that losing some of those conventions from the last 500 years is going to be the downfall of our country.
Oh,
so
wow. Okay.
So I was very pleased that the podcast host had me on to take the other position.
Yes. And well, I'll tell you what, one of the things that was very exciting to me, and I'll be honest, when I look through lists of things and opportunities for people that I can have on and stuff. There are buzzwords, aren't there, that we have been taught to think, oh, I hope that's not this, if that makes sense. And when I see things like terms about, like, biology is a word that has been weaponized to mean things that it does not mean. And as I was reading your book, I was like, okay, great. Because I hear so many people that use the word and we're going to get right into this because you highlight this. There's certain words people use that become weaponized. One of them is biology or biological nowadays. I see people misusing the word biological applied to gender as a way to discriminate against trans people, obviously. And so when we hear that word, they're like, I know what biology means. And it's like, oh, you clearly don't really. The other word, though, you bring this out in the book too, is the word natural. People saying something is or isn't natural, and what they really mean by it is or isn't okay. And they're going to use that as a club to beat people that they don't like over the head with it, right? And so, yeah,
that's exactly right. Yeah.
And maybe that's a good framework of kind of getting into what is this book and what made you decide to write this?
Well, I think you framed it very well in the sense that what is natural is really what I'm trying to get at in this book. And my first book, way back when I was writing that, more than 10 years ago, I had a couple of chapters on animal pair bonding. And the book was about animal behavior more generally, but I had a chapter on, sort of love and connection and basically the neurohormones involved in attachment. And in the process of doing the research for that, I really was very surprised at, first of all, the similarities that humans and animals have about when they become attached to someone and what that does to them physiologically as well as behaviorally or psychologically, if we're talking about humans. But then also about how it can take all kinds of different shapes, both in humans and in animals. We get attached to people. We get attached to our friends, our children, our cousins, even work colleagues, you can form an attachment with them. But the sexual attachment seems to be, something, a little bit different. It's a different flavor of that attachment, even though the neurobiology works the same way. Well, when I was doing, all that reading and all that research and, putting things together, I realized that there's a lot more going on with animals than most people realize. We're kind of taught that you have, daddy bird and mommy bird get together, make a nest, and have baby bird. And it's just, we've modeled our thinking about animal behavior based on what we think human behavior, sort of is or should be. And I realized that biologists have been uncovering a much more complicated picture when it comes to animal behavior. And but that's fairly recent. Unfortunately, and I say a lot about this in the book, for a long time, biologists had those blinders on about human culture. And they really did, they really wanted to see the world in a specific way. They squinted hard at those birds, to see a human family, and it really colored the way that they did the research. So
I loved your example of hyenas, by the way. This is what I remembered from reading you when you were saying that that at one point the position was that all female hyenas are masking are exhibiting masculine traits instead of this.
Yeah, they're male mimics. That's the whole species of male mimics. Instead of just kind of realizing that hyenas are a little different, and that they're males, they're females, and it happens to be a female-dominated species, and their females, have a very peculiar anatomy in the hyenas, and that confused people. But that's the thing is we when we see things like that. We call things male typical and female typical. And when something behaves outside of what we expect, we don't know what to do with that. It bothers us, because we love our categories and our labels, and predictability is part of, what makes us, feel comfortable and feel at ease. So this book is going to make a lot of people uncomfortable, I think, and by design. And the thing is that it doesn't really prescribe anything for us. Like I don't come out here and say, this is what humans should be doing. We shouldn't be doing that. We need to do that. I think that's up to all of us as a culture and a society about what to do with all of this. But what I am really pushing back again, to bring this full circle to your first question, is if you're going to say that humans should or shouldn't do something, if you're going to say it's natural or unnatural, you got to get your facts right. And so when people are talking about, for example, homosexuality or same-sex sexuality and calling it unnatural, well, that's just not true. There is nothing unnatural about it. Now, that's not a value statement. It might be good, it might be bad, but it's not unnatural. It is perfectly natural, because we see it in basically all social animals, have pretty broad sexuality. So that's really what I'm reacting against, is people trying to claim the scientific high ground, and with poor basis. Yeah. I would say that, particularly right now with some of the fights about whether it's transgender issues or gay issues, people were saying that they want to frame this as you have gender activists on one side and science on the other one. You have feelings over here, but accuracy is over here. Well, I'm sorry, science is not on your side. If you think that that gender is simple and that sexuality is always heterosexual and always procreative and all that. So this book is going to unsettle people who are, tied to very strict definitions of these things.
Yeah, I think that when we get into the perversion of the term natural, right, the use of it in a weaponized way is really just another method of social control. And people always like to grab onto something that they say, oh, this is why I'm right. I realized a long, long time ago that if natural was the measuring stick by which people were really bothered, then as soon as you could show, which we can, and have been able to for years and years and years, that, as you put it, like homosexuality is a naturally occurring thing, that people just, they have a sexual orientation, and also definitely, sexual interactions between same-sex or opposite-sex partners all happen in the natural world. Then we should go, oh, cool. Okay. Well, thanks for educating me. Now I know that it's okay, and let's move on. That's not what they mean at all, right? There's a societal value kind of trying to take over, and it's what we feel like is kind of this approvable. We're going to use this as some way to define that. And And I
Yeah,
really
I mean, to be
liked,
honest, they picked
yeah,
this fight. A lot of, the conservative reactionaries really picked this fight. And so I want to be clear that I'm not saying that just because something happens in the natural world, it's perfectly fine. Because you
sure,
got to remember, there's, gorillas murder infants.
right.
Infanticide is very common among basically all the apes. And I would never advocate that we, adopt that particular behavior. So I'm not saying that we could model anything,
Cross that
off.
question off there. See,
Yeah,
feelings on
yeah.
infanticide. Got that?
Right, right, right. No, no, no. That would be the naturalistic fallacy, and I'm more about basically preventing other people from misusing that than I am to for us to use that. But I
Well,
do
because it
know
is
that.
a
Mhm, go
it
ahead.
is a misuse as well for people to say, even if it was something, even if we didn't know, even if there was no anything in the animals, why does that mean that there shouldn't be with us and vice versa? I mean, you're kind of saying like, because people do try to have that both ways, I think. Right.
Right, right, and I don't think that would be fair and reasonable. But I do think that when you look at the natural world and the way that they engage, sex, gender, and sexuality, there's a lot to celebrate. There's a lot to notice, and it does strike back against our tendency to try to see things as fixed and simple and binary, with these nice, clean categories. That's a human tendency. We really want things to be crystal clear and to be, none of these fuzzy borders or gray area. But unfortunately, that's not how life works. Biology is all about spectra, not binaries. Things always bleed into one another. There's always exceptions to every rule. And in fact, actually, the exceptions are what fascinates biology the most, because they often really reveal deep truths about whatever it is that you're studying. And so I do hope a lot of people read this book from across the political spectrum. I really tried not to be too political with it, because ultimately biology is just aiming to describe the natural world. That's what
Yeah.
we do. Here it is.
Right.
What we do with that is not necessarily our job to say. It's everyone's job to say.
Right. And I thought, some of the things that you bring up are things I was not aware of. I did not know, for example, and this is particularly true amongst apes, but not only, that animals do have a lot of sexual interactions that are not simply procreative, because that's sort of what, we're always kind of taught, right? Is that we have a real divide of, here's human sex is all about the emotional attachments and the romantic attachments we have, and animal sex is all about, just producing babies and
Making babies. Yeah.
they're right. And we're all so much different. And there is a little bit of a, egocentric fascination we have as a species, right? That we're special and all the rest of them aren't.
Right.
But I thought that was interesting when you detailed that there are, and I think you'd even said amongst bonobos monkeys, right? That the ones that actually did have more interactive social community building through sexual interactions, that they actually don't kill each other as much as the other ones do.
Yeah, it's another way that they figured out to solve conflicts and have reconciliation. Sex is great for that, right?
Sure. But yeah, but using that for something other than just a natural, like making children or procreation kind of a thing, and that is across so many different species. I thought that was fascinating to me.
Yeah, me too. Me too. Because, I grew up in the same world you did. Same, everyone did, where we were sort of taught that sex is for making babies. And, humans, have a little fun with it, but that's as far as it goes. But actually that's not true. Animals use sex for a whole variety of purposes. And, some of them are pro-social, some of them are anti-social. It's, it can be manipulative, it can be coercive, it can be deceptive. And there are animals that pay each other for sex, and then there are there are animals that trick them into paying and then not giving them the sex. I mean, basically everything that you see with the way humans use it, you can find correlates in most of the other species. I mean, just think of it this way: if every time you had sex, it led to procreation, imagine how many children we'd all have. So we know that that's not true for us, and the same is true in most other species. They're not only having sex to have babies. And the thing is other species actually are much more aware of when they're fertile than humans are, right? So humans, if you look at female reproductive cycle in humans, we have what's called concealed ovulation. You never really know when the fertile period is. But other animals don't have menstrual cycles. They have estrus cycles where they advertise that they're fertile. Well, if it was only about procreation, that's the only time they would have sex. And that's not at all true, right? If you look at chimpanzees, they're always having sex. Do they have more sex during estrus? Yes, because the sex drive is enhanced. because of its ancient attachment to ovulation. But they're having sex all throughout the month. Well, they don't do month cycles like we do, but they all throughout the year, they have sex. But actually, the exception also proves the rule in this case, because if you look at orangutans, they don't really have sex except when they're in estrus, but they are antisocial as adults. They are solitary. They almost never interact with each other. They're territorial. So all of those other purposes of sex are missing because they're not social. So they don't have sex in those times. You see what I mean? Like, it kind of proves the point. So when they restrict their sexuality just to procreation, it's because they don't really do any of those other things with dominance hierarchies and building alliances and any of that. They're really solitary as adults. And that's why, sex really is a couple of days a year for them.
Wow. I thought and I know this is not all about apes, and you have lots of different experience with or things you talk about with fish and birds and things, but I was intrigued also by how much culture there is amongst the animal species. And you mentioned in particular a gorilla preserve, I think, where there had been some, I guess you could, I don't know, I'm going to misuse the word evolution here, right? Social evolution, I guess, or some social changes that were happening in the way that gorillas were hanging out. And that seemed pretty different than what we'd seen gorillas do for like a long time before, right?
That's right. And I think this is one of the stories that should be told more. So we always thought, because of the early work on gorillas, that they operate like we think lion prides do, with one dominant male, the silverback, and then a small harem of females, 5, 6, 7 females, and then their children. And that's it. That's the gorilla group. And most gorilla groups indeed are that way. But there's a group that's been living in Uganda that basically, when the males grew up, the sons of the silverback, they just didn't leave. And normally you're supposed to. You're supposed to leave because your dad will kill you if you try to challenge. If you stick around too long when you're growing up as a male gorilla, you have to leave. You go up, there's a solitary period, you get a little stronger, and then you go try to take over a harem. That's what we always thought gorillas do. Well, in this group, they're not, and they're sticking around. And the group has swelled in size, 60, 70 members in this group now. And they're living in the park. It's a preserve, so they're somewhat protected from poachers, but not perfectly. It's not like that's the answer, because there's unfortunately still a lot of poaching that goes on. And they're living in harmony. The adult males don't particularly interact. They're not close partners, but they are tolerant of each other's sexual behaviors. And so everything we thought we knew about how gorillas interact was just thrown out the window. And what we found is that they're flexible also. They can make their families in slightly different ways, different versions. They probably won't go from this to like monogamy in the nuclear family, at least not in one quick step. But with really no genetic change, no real evolution, you would say, or at least not genetic evolution, you have a complete upheaval in their social structure, and they're fine. They're thriving. Everyone's happy. And in fact, we talk about this as mostly a male-dominated, group, but that misunderstands it too, because the females are really the social masters. The males are very aggressive and they can beat your ass if they need to, but the women are the ones that do most of the socializing, and they kind of maintain the order. And so it's very possible that this was a female-driven event. Maybe they were tired of all of this. Who knows? But
it's a great point. Isn't it?
And it is becoming enculturated. So this is now what they're used to, and it's a couple of generations now.
It's a fascinating thing to see play out. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that is also a tenet of biology that we misinterpret a lot in common parlance, is the whole alpha deal, right? I mean, don't we make, I think a lot of guys in particular. And by the way, one of the things that endeared me to your book is the use of the phrase dude bros, which I say all the time. And I saw you use that in there once. But anyway, I feel like we have a concept of like alpha. You've got to alpha someone if you want what you want or whatever. And I think we don't understand that correctly commonly, right?
No, we really don't, because the alpha, if you want to use that term for social mammals, when you have groups and there's a dominance hierarchy, that can come with certain privileges, usually mating privileges, but can come with other privileges as well. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're in charge. It doesn't mean that in fact, a male lion, even if it is a single male that's running a pride, he certainly will resist any encroachment by other males, but he's in no way the boss of the females. He doesn't, run the show. In fact, the females really run the show. The only thing that he's really in charge of is who gets to mate with those females, and he restricts it to himself. Although, as I mentioned in the book, most lion prides actually have a coalition of males, and there is one who's in charge, but he's in charge of the males, not the females. So
they
alpha,
also will have sex with each other, though. The male lions quite frequently will, right?
That's right. Male. If you have a pride run by multiple males, a coalition, they call that. Yes, they're sexually active with each other, and that helps strengthen their bond. It helps them get along. It helps them, smooth out any, conflicts. Sex is great for conflict resolution, and we see this, in married couples as well. We call it makeup sex, right? Sure. It's a way to put the conflict behind us.
There's a joke in there somewhere with gay lion sex and pride, but I'm not landing it in my head. I just wanted to make sure everyone listening knows that I know that it's there. All of you can reach out to me if you can make a good Pride Month.
I think it's a T-shirt.
Maybe Pride Month. I don't know. Yeah, there's something there. But once again, nobody ever talks about that. And why not? Because, as you said, science is supposedly about the observation of what goes on in the world, but what trickles down to us, I could just envision someone even knowing that say, but I wouldn't want that to be taught in a biology class. But why not? Well, because we have some attachment of a bias to it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that bias has influenced a lot about, first of all, what kind of science gets done and how it's interpreted. But then when the science is published and announced to the world, it goes through those filters of bias as well. And so what actually makes it into classrooms and newspapers and all this has been filtered quite a bit. And in fact, actually, Sue Carter is probably the world's expert on monogamy. And her work on prairie voles is constantly misinterpreted because they're socially monogamous. They form very tight bonds, dyads. It's just two individuals, but they're not sexually exclusive in those dyads. That's their main sexual partner. But both the male and the female, or if it's same sex, they have plenty of sex outside of that partnership. And she's known that from day one, from her earliest papers. It's right there in the data, right there in the earliest articles. But yet every time her work not every time, but most of the time it gets presented to the public, they said that they refer to it basically as sexual monogamy. And it's not. It's never has been, but it's very close social monogamy. And I think she's been very frustrated by this. What do I have to do to teach you people that sexual monogamy and social monogamy are different things? One is very common, at least in birds and in some mammals, and one is very rare. But they're very different, and that's bias because we want to see animal monogamy the way that we want human monogamy to be, which is this kind of Victorian ideal of sexual fidelity from first vows to your grave. But animals don't do that; they just don't.
Well, I'll tell you, my experience being also, in my as a therapist, working with people and working in gender affirming kind of care, working with a lot of trans individuals who are going through, different treatments for gender dysphoria, including often transition, obviously, particularly going through that, man, the people who have their own kind of bias and opposition to that, they are just hungry for any scrap of anything they think means that this is all the terrible things they think or that they've been told and that they're afraid of are actually true. And I've just had so many people that email me something or share something with me and say, well, look, isn't this terrible? And you look at it and you're like, well, first of all, maybe it doesn't say that. Second of all, maybe it's not even from a researcher. It's just some op-ed piece, or it comes from a researcher who you can Google and they're going like, hey, why are people using my research? Just like what you just said. If that's not what that means. I didn't say that. And, people we will jump through lots of hoops to try to make the world look like how we want it to look, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's the power of the anecdote where, a single anecdote can overpower all kinds of data in someone's mind because they latch onto the anecdote, and that's what makes the argument. But that's a double-edged sword because anecdotes are also, convincing and they're a colorful way to tell the story. My book is full of anecdotes. Yeah. So I understand we connect to anecdotes much more than we connect to statistics and data.
Yeah.
And that's part of how the human mind, creates reality. So there's nothing bad about that, but it's just important to remember that an anecdote is a single piece of data.
Hmm.
And it can have its own problems even unto itself. But when you're trying to draw big conclusions, it's important to look at lots of examples. And we talk about that with statistical significance and so forth in science. And I caution everyone, don't be overpowered, by a single anecdote, because there is that tendency. Our brain wants to do that.
Yeah. You talk a lot about the cooperative element of animals. There we go. Of animals, of which people are a subset, right? Anyway, so you talk about the cooperative nature of the relationships, and you'd read that with fish, with bugs, with apes, that there are times where you'll have like two male partners will partner up, and that they will run the show for a while, and that might have to do with attracting, and that some females are more likely to go for a pairing instead of just like that alpha or whatever. They go for not quite as strong, but they're working together, and there's a lot of little how should I put it, not just paired, that's what you called it, right? Not just pair ups, but there's different family arrangements, if we want to call them family arrangements, that happen. I think but it all has to do with cooperativity and enhancing chances of success.
Yeah. So if you take the sunfish, for example, and they're not unique in this, but sunfish are the organism in which this has been well studied. They want to build a nest, and it takes them some time. The males build a nest, and females will come and they kind of judge the males based on the size and location of their nest. So the prime spots are in the middle, because they do this as a large group. They want the largest nest right near the center, because that way it's the most protected from predators that would come in from the outside, right? So the males compete against one another to establish the best territory with the most well-developed nest. Well, females are smart. They come in sometimes and notice that two males working together are actually better nest defenders, because once she lays her eggs, at least in sunfish, she goes away. She's gone. And those males stay for about 2 weeks as those eggs develop and hatch. So if two males are better than one at protecting the eggs that she's laying, well, has an advantage. Her genetic interests are well served by choosing a pair of males rather than just one. And it's not like, well, then you're like, well, why don't they all pair up? But you got to remember, there's also competition. Competition and cooperation always go hand in hand. It's not all hunky dory, everyone, gumdrops and rainbows out there in nature. There's a lot of competition as well, and it can be violent competition. And so there's this jockeying that takes place. So should I go alone as a big alpha male, as we would say, and have the big nest, or do I accept a partner and then I have to share paternity with this partner, so I won't have quite as many fish? But actually, if they're more likely to successful, maybe I will. It's all of this calculation that goes on. And remember that fish have very small nervous systems, so they're not thinking these things through, right? Evolution rewards success by just having more numbers, right? So if you have more success, then you leave more offspring, and those instincts are selected for. So, but that's kind of the thing that goes on is this, cooperativity versus competition. And one thing, maybe not so much in fish, but in lots of other creatures, part of the reason why cooperation and competition are so closely linked is that it uses the same psychological skills, right? So if you want to work against someone and manipulate them, or compete against them, you need to understand how they think. You got to have that cognitive empathy. You really got to understand someone in order to beat them well, right? But that's the exact same skill set that you use to cooperate with them, to understand what motivates them, what they're after, and what they need, what will make them feel good, and all that. So all the same skills for competition are useful in cooperation, and so they tend to go together. And then what creatures do is the in-group is who they cooperate with, and the out-group is who they compete against. And that can be defined as just groups in the same species, that can be siblings, versus, non-siblings, or it can be, completely at the largest level, which is this species against that species. Whatever it is, the same kind of skill set is used. And when animals approach reproduction that way, that's how you can see this fish fights other males but the one next to him is willing to cooperate with one. And we see this in other creatures as well. I'm using fish as an example. I like fish as an example because they're the nest builders, which goes against our instincts to say, oh, well, the females are the ones that take care of the nest. Well, no, there's plenty of species where it's the other way around.
Yeah. Huh. Yeah, you opened up with this reflections about Finding Nemo, right? About how that would play out if it was real clownfish instead of cartoon ones with previously hired voice actors of a certain gender.
Right. I mean, so one thing that's clear is at the beginning of the movie, I don't know if spoiler alert here. If you haven't seen the movie, watch it. If
you haven't watched the first 3 minutes of Finding Nemo, this is a spoiler for that. Everybody be ready. Go watch that. Come back.
So Nemo's mother passes away. She's lost, and his father Marlin, and they get separated. So his father Marlin is going to be out looking for Nemo for the rest of the movie. Well, the way that clownfish families work is you have a breeding male and a breeding female, and then a whole bunch of males that are waiting their turn. So you have an alpha male, beta male, gamma, delta, and so on. But you only have one female. There's only one female in the group. Well, when she's lost, as in this case, it would be Nemo's mother, there's no female left. So what happens is the alpha male becomes the alpha female. He switches his sex. It takes about a month. It begins in his brain. We actually understand some of the gene expression involved in this. It begins in the brain because that's where he sort of senses the lack of a female. And because he's the alpha, he's the one that gets to change. And then all of the others move up in rank. So the beta male becomes alpha male and so on. And they grow a little bit because age and size are matched. But what I find is most interesting is the other ones know their place. They don't overtake the order. They wait their turn. And then they move up. Like, what kind of discipline that takes at the biochemical level,
Sure.
But anyways, to bring it back to the movie, in the time that it takes for Marlin to find Nemo, he would have switched to female.
Marlene. There we go. It was right there.
Jeez. He would be his mother now. But of course, he would then also mate with Nemo. So I don't think we really want to take this analogy too much farther. That's generally how it works, though, is they all move up in rank, but here's what's great about it is it's a great way of quality control, because in order to become breeders, you have to survive long enough. Mm-hmm. So you're born at the bottom of the heap, and then you have to survive all the way up until it's your turn to breed. And that's one of many ways that creatures have quality control. So you weed out the bad genes and all of that by they just don't make it to get to the breeding privileges.
One of the things that you mention is the idea of sex being biological and gender being cultural. That is an overly simplified term. You go into how gender and culture both have to do with biology in the book, if I'm saying that right.
Well, yeah, I think that the way I use the term biological sex is it refers to bodies, right? So your physical body has a sex to it, and it's not necessarily very simple in all cases with a binary, and I argue against a binary in a lot of cases. But I really think it's a property of your body, sex is. Whereas gender is a psychosocial phenomenon, and how you interact with your culture and with other individuals within that culture. So, and the terms masculine and feminine, have to do with gender. They have to do with what the expressions are of a sexed body in a particular culture. So what is masculine today will be very different than what was masculine, 10,000 years ago before farming was developed anywhere in the world. So when you have these expressions of masculine and femininity, that's gender. And of course, it springs from biology. It springs from our bodies, but it's different than that. And it's different than that in animals as well. You can have different ways of being a male. And that's what I refer to as gender in animals.
And that's where I remember it, because you had said with some, we tended to label more aggressive behaviors as more masculine. But then when we look at an animal species where maybe that's not the case, we mentioned the hyena thing, I think already, but it's like, instead of saying like, oh, in this case, actually that's a feminine trait in this species, we go, oh, the girl hyenas act like dudes.
Right. And so Yeah, that's right. Male hyenas are very submissive, and that is a masculine trait in that space. And so I'm not one that rejects the words masculine and feminine. Some do. Some really go far with this. I think the words can be harmful, but I don't know another word to say that it's associated mostly with a body that is sexed male. You know what I mean? So
Sure.
masculine is just a convenient way to describe it, but I don't mean it as a strict binary, and I don't even mean that an individual is going to be masculine all across the board. You know, an individual can be a collection of traits, both physical and psychological, and some of those will fit into the masculine column, and some of them will fit more in the feminine column. There's nothing wrong with that individual. We are all mosaics of traits. So we all know males that have, sort of what we think of as female body shape, right? Or we all know women. I know women who can bench press way more than me, and that are taller than me, faster. All of these things have, typical ranges, but there's nothing wrong with someone who's outside of a range on any of these measures, whether it's, chemical or even in, shape of certain brain parts. There's a lot of variability, and there's nothing wrong because nature's always producing that variability. Nature just doesn't track in these clean binaries. And that's to bring it way back to the beginning of this interview. That's the point of sexual reproduction, is to unlink all these traits so that they can be selected for and against by the environment. Because if you link everything together, well, then, you're going to trap good traits with bad traits because they're stuck in the same individuals. By mixing it up all the time, you create new combinations. So in a particular environment, a feminine trait might be advantageous, regardless of the sex of the individual. And so you want to be able to select for that without it getting only half of the population gets access to it, right? For example, body hair is good for both men and women, right? It is not sexually dimorphic to have body hair, but men have it on our faces more than women do. But we all know some women who have quite a bit of hair on their face, right? We all know some men who barely need to shave at all. There's nothing wrong with them, right? That's the variability that we're talking about. So that if nature ever wanted to select for everyone to have smooth faces or for everyone to have hairy faces, it could do it. And it could do it relatively quickly because it's not purely restricted by sex. And most of our physical traits, I would argue, are not restricted purely by sex. They might be sex influenced. They might, you might have male typical, female typical differences, but everyone is a mosaic of those traits. And I think that, that doesn't negate the idea that men and women are different. Of course we have differences. In fact, I think it affirms those differences and celebrates those differences. Mm-hmm. As long as we don't think of these traits as like better or worse, superior or inferior.
And that's the problem, right? Yeah.
That's the problem.
Yeah, the little definitions. I use this a lot. We look at the term, take the term normal, for example. Mm-hmm. People get very resistant to the term, what is normal, what is not normal? And that's 100% because of how we use it. Like normal, in my mindset, like the real definition of normal is almost mathematical, right? It's typical, normative, whatever. Whereas when we say normal, though, the reason why it's a problematic word now is because we use it to say valid or that's okay or that's not okay. You're not normal or whatever. Right. And it kind of like the word natural, like I said earlier, but when we have this extra baggage attached to these words, it's not really what they mean, and that we're using it to say, just like you said, with masculine and feminine. Typically that's often been used as a positive. We could say positive and negative. Negative being the feminine traits are taught and influenced.
I mean, we called women the weaker sex, right? We called women the weaker sex. I mean, it was just something that was out there that wasn't even seen as offensive, right? So hopefully we've come a long way with that. And I'm glad you brought up the word normal because. Statistically speaking, you have a normal distribution and there's not any, baggage associated with that. But out in the real world, normal is the opposite of abnormal, and abnormal is undesirable, weird, and should be discarded or whatever. But actually, if you think about it, every evolutionary innovation began as an abnormality. Right? Think about the transitions between species and any innovation that evolution's ever come up with began with an individual who was different, who had this variance, who really didn't fit in with everybody else. And in that case, it was something beneficial, and then it slowly took over in the population. But thank God that person wasn't seen as a freak and kicked out and shunned from society. I mean, being abnormal just means that you have something that not everybody does. And unfortunately, the world that we've built really rewards conformity. And if you think differently and act differently than the herd, you're really at a disadvantage. But that's just because of the culture that we've built. This isn't part of this book, but since it's come up, I want to mention it. We talk about neurotypical versus neurodiverse people. There's all kinds of ways. In a lot of cases, I mean, it can be debilitating. There can be a medical aspect to it, but for a lot of them, I tend to wonder if what we describe as neurodivergent is just someone who doesn't fit into this particular world that we've built. We've built things that really reward certain ways of thinking. But actually, imagine if you lived in a small group of 150 individuals out in nature, wouldn't it be good to have some individuals who don't think the same way as everyone, who notice things differently, who have, extreme hyper focus on a certain task or whatever? All of these different properties of the way that the brain works, that would have been insulation against uncertain conditions, to have some individual who can help the group to do something different. So I think to keep that in mind when you read this book is that gender diversity, sexual diversity, might very well fall into that category, that variability, that variance, that diversity in the group was good. And it was good because you never know what the next challenge is. So it's good to have lots of different kinds of people in the mix so that somebody can keep the species going.
Absolutely. You're right on. I'm so glad to hear you say that, because I observe this, and I've worked with a lot of people with ADHD, with bipolar disorder, I'm diagnosed with those myself, as well as people on the autism spectrum. And I wonder if we were to flash a generation or two in the future, how many of our grandkids, kids or whatever are going to be saying things like, can you believe they used to classify this type of mental process as a disorder, those cavemen that lived back in 2025. Just things like that. I envision, and I hope we're moving more towards, instead of saying neurodiverse and neurotypical, just talking about neurodiversity, that we all, exist in different ways in different parts of different spectrums. Right. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I've looked over just the years, whether it's gender diversity, sexual orientation, neurodiversity, and you think of all of the disservice just on an interpersonal level that people do by not allowing themselves to get to know the vibrant, community of people that is out there, of all different types of people, and saying not only, evolutionarily, socially, what are the things that are going to be really, really valuable, and how much people worry about, things are changing. And to your point, it's things should change this way and that way, that there should be lots of different people. Maybe by trying to stymie that, we're hurting ourselves more. And I would say, trying to push into conformity, we're damaging ourselves and our development.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of wasted potential. It's a lot of wasted ability. And it's also just inhumane. I think the way that we really, reward conformity. And in evolutionary biology, there's what we call destabilizing selection and stabilizing selection. Stabilizing selection is when you really just do promote everybody doing the same thing and the best, survive and all of that. Well, but we see destabilizing selection a lot too, which specifically allows and selects and rewards difference from the norm, difference from the way that everybody else is doing something, because sometimes just being different is an advantage in and of itself. And I do talk about that briefly in the book, and I give some examples. I give some non-sexual examples, but also sexual examples of being different gave you an advantage. And I think that the lesson that biologists have learned by watching nature is that diversity, creativity, flexibility, adaptability, that's the best recipe for success. And somehow our culture just missed that lesson, for too long. And I hope that we're rediscovering it now. And I hope that, with these observations being made more widely known in the population, we can start to recapture that celebration of diversity. But unfortunately, some people are threatened by diversity. And, and it's no coincidence who those people are, what they look like, and how they live, right? So when you're living in the dominant modes of these various ways, the celebration of diversity feels like an attack on yourself. But really, no one's trying to push anyone out. We're just trying to celebrate the diversity that's already here and what it brings to the table.
Wow. Well, it's a great I mean, not only is it a good cause and a good message and all that kind of thing, you bring a lot of good information to help people to get there and to think about all of these different things. There's just so much into this book. I really, really highly recommend it to people. And also it's fun. That's the other thing. Just the way that you tell the stories and things is engaging, which is always, always a nice thing in any kind of particularly nonfiction, but that it's a fun read as well. I feel like, and I can tell why sitting here and talking to you now.
I do like to laugh, and I like other people to laugh. I'm a teacher at heart, right? So I teach in the classroom. Like, if it's been 5 minutes and my students hasn't laughed, then that's a problem.
Yeah, exactly.
So I do like, because it also puts you in a good mood. You're a better learner when you're like happy to be there. So I do hope that people laugh out loud a couple times in the book.
Well, I want to give you a chance to tell people where they can follow your work. Before we hit that, I always have my little question for every guest about, do you have any modes of giving back to the community that you are near and dear to your heart, either a good practice or perhaps an organization, nonprofit, a charity that you would endorse for our listeners?
Yeah, some of the longest term charities that I've been a part of have been Planned Parenthood and Save the Children. So Save the Children is kind of my global charity. I've been giving to that since 1997, if you can believe that. I've had a monthly donation that I did it once to impress a girl, if you can believe that.
Did it work?
It did. We dated for a while. I mean, obviously it didn't work out long term, but
except for all the children, if you kept donating. So hey, it worked out for
it worked out for them. That's right. And then Planned Parenthood, and I think that it's ever more important to make sure that reproductive rights are being defended, especially across state lines. And so those are the two. But then I've also been a donor to Lambda Legal and the Human Rights Campaign. Lambda Legal, because I think we're going to have a lot of legal fights on our hands in the next few years. And they're coming after trans people. They're very well might be coming after the gays as well. So I think that those are the organizations that I would urge people to support.
Great. That's Land Illegal, you said?
No, Lambda.
Lambda. That makes sense.
Lambda
okay, never
Legal.
mind. I was like, what? Okay.
Yeah.
Lambda
Legal.
Legal. Gotcha.
Yeah.
No, we're wonderful.
And,
yeah.
And for finding me on social media, if you just Google Nathan Lents, I think I'm probably the only one. Certainly it's easy to find me, Twitter, Blue Sky, Threads, Facebook. I'll be honest, I don't use social media that much. I probably should do more. I think the publisher and the publicist, they I'm sure they want me to do more. I'm not sure that social media is the best way to use one's time, but I am there and you can find me, and I do answer DMs.
Awesome. Okay. It's Nathan Lents, Lents, by the way, so people know that as well. It's an S at the end, not a Z.
That's right.
Great. Well, I also want to take a second just to plug our highlighted. We highlight a local charity each month as well, and this month we're highlighting the D Coffee Foundation. You've heard me mention that one. It's D Coffee, as in Delise Coffee. Dr. Delise Coffee is a sports psychologist who runs this program for the use of athleticism and athletic scholarships to help youth who are coming from underprivileged areas to find access to education. And you can go to dcoffeefoundation.org. That's coffee spelled COFFEY. So dcoffeefoundation.org to learn more about and participate there. As always, if anyone joins our Patreon for bonus materials and to support The Broken Brain, 50% of your donation will go to the charity that was being focused in the month in which you did join for ever and ever and ever, which I assume is the length of time that you'll be a donor. And so half of that will go there, or just go to dcoffeefoundation.org to donate and get involved directly with them as well there. So, Nathan, I'm just so grateful to spend this time with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This was a fun interview.
Thank you for listening to the Courtemp Arts Podcast Network. To listen to more Courtemp Arts shows, visit courtemparts.com.